Logged on. All right, everyone. Well, welcome. We can go ahead and get started because I know this is various times across the world people are joining in from. And so I just want to first introduce myself and then introduce Dr. Chana Teeger. So I'm Cassie Pittman Clater, and I am a lover of RIM and a part of the advisory council. And it is my honor today to be the facilitator and organizer of this step. So these step segments are part of an effort to sort of introduce South African society and some of the complexities around it to members of RIM, as we will be having our conference there this upcoming January in Cape Town, which is very exciting. So today we have Dr. Chana Teeger. And Chana, you can also add to your biography any additional notes that I might miss. But Dr. Chana Teeger is a dear friend of mine, and she's a brilliant scholar. Right now, she is an associate professor in the Department of Methodology at the London School of Economics, as well as a senior research associate at the Department of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg. So she is trained as a sociologist, as an ethnographer, and her research really aims to grapple with the complexities, the causes, as well as the remedies of social inequality. And much of her work looks at memory, but she also addresses issues of racial inequality, and her work has spanned international context. So she's going to talk today about her work in South Africa, but she also brings to us knowledge of various complexities around race and racial inequality, and also memory. Her work has appeared in distinguished venues such as the American Sociological Review, as well as the American Journal of Sociology, as well as the Journal of Sociology of Education. And her book, which she will be discussing today, is called Distancing the Past: Racism as History in South African Schools. And so this discussion today, I think, is going to be really informative. And much of the work focuses on this generation that is called the born free, which I've really loved this idea. I mean, I don't know, that's just a wonderful way, a nomenclature to describe a generation, even though in the book she really grapples with what that means. So the born free are the youth who basically came of age in a post-apartheid regime. And so we're going to delve into that more today. What does that mean to be born in a post-apartheid South Africa, but still to deal with the realities of race and racism and racial inequality, and how the schools are really this pivotal institution, and they have this transformative potential, but in many ways, they don't necessarily connect the students and connect them to this context. And so what does that really mean if we look at how history is presented in the classroom? So that is my introduction. And again, welcome and thank you so much for agreeing to do this book chat with us. And Chana, I don't know if there's more that you, or Dr. Teeger, is there's more that you'd
Oh,
like to add?
no,
Figured
thank you.
I figure we would go into a sort of an overview, a very brief overview of the book for those who are unfamiliar with the work, and just to give them a snapshot of what are some of the themes that you grapple with.
Thank you so much, Cassie, for that very generous introduction. And for the great summary of my book. I feel like I should hand it over to you because I'm like, yes, that's what I was trying to do. But let me just give kind of a brief overview of what, just how the book is structured and what I'm trying to do in it. So, the study, like Cassie explained, is it's kind of a school ethnography. So, it's a study of two schools in South Africa. These are very particular types of schools. So they're state schools, they're government schools, but they are a particular type, which is known as former Model C schools in South Africa. So they are schools that were whites only during apartheid and that desegregated during the transition. The schools that I chose they're like top performing former Model C schools. And I chose them because not because they're representative of all schools in South Africa, right? So the sampling for a small scale, qualitative study, you can't get, there's no such thing as a representative school. But I sampled on kind of theoretically, trying to think about what types of schools I wanted to look at. And I decided that I wanted to look at how histories of racial oppression are discussed in contexts of diversity. And these schools are schools that are quite diverse. They're probably the most racially and socioeconomically diverse schools in the country. So they present a particular kind of social context in which people are talking and learning about histories of racial oppression, but they're learning it in a racially diverse context. And so I focused on these two schools, which are called Glenville and Roxbridge. These are pseudonyms. And I used a combination of data collection techniques. I sat in on history classrooms. So in both schools, I spent about 2.5 months going back to high school. So the age group that I focused on was they're 14 to 15-year-olds. This is grade 9 in South Africa. And this is a year when all students across the country have to learn about apartheid in a mandatory history module. So it's a compulsory school subject in the national curriculum. So I sat in on these classroom discussions, so 17 different classrooms. I also interviewed students. I interviewed 160 students who I kind of randomly selected from class lists that were stratified by race. Half of them I interviewed before they took this module, and the other half I interviewed after they had completed it. I also spoke to all the teachers who taught them, and I analyzed documents, and I just spent a lot of time in these schools, basically. What I found, and that's what the title of the book is that although apartheid was engaged with, it wasn't erased from the curriculum. It was very much remembered, but it was taught and remembered in a very particular kind of way, and in a way that distanced this past from young people's everyday reality. So it taught about this history of racial oppression in a way that presented it as something that's over, that's done, and that's quite foreign and distant from present-day South Africa. And the book really, the way it structures, it details 3 mechanisms of distancing. I'll briefly mention them. The first one is juxtapositions. And here I look at the juxtaposition of apartheid, in particular with the Holocaust. So they learned about apartheid and the Holocaust in the same year. There were these different modules. And what this juxtaposition did was it created hierarchies of oppression in young people's minds, but it also constructed this idea of apartheid as an event that had come and gone, and that started in 1948 and ended in 1994. Instead of embedding it, for example, in a longer module on colonialism or dispossession in Southern Africa, that would stretch the historical narrative backwards in time, right, and then forwards also into the present. So it kind of by juxtaposing apartheid with the Holocaust, it presented it as this history that was neatly contained and disconnected from anything else in South African history, really. The second kind of the second mechanism, which I call equivalences, was these where what I found was that teachers were weaving these narrative lines into the history where they were sort of trying to complicate the association of whites as perpetrators and blacks as victims. So they would often talk about white resistors to apartheid, and they would speak about black perpetrators or black collaborators. And really what they would do is focus on individuals and the choices that they made. And what this does, I think, is also distance the past, because it teaches about apartheid in terms of individuals and individual choices, instead of seeing it as apartheid as a system that privileged and disadvantaged individuals as a result of their racial group membership, right? And the implicit message is you can't make assumptions about what people did in the past based on their race, and so therefore don't think about the present in racial terms either. And importantly, in kind of constructing the history in terms of the victim-perpetrator binary, they leave out completely a discussion of beneficiaries, which is what continues into the present, right? So it frames apartheid in this very specific way, the specific subject positions that historical actors could occupy, and therefore present-day actors also. And the final mechanism, which I call simulations, this is mostly at Glenville, at one of the schools, but they did a little bit of role-playing at both schools, but it was mostly at Glenville, where for the duration of the apartheid section, they had students, they role played apartheid. They had students enter the classroom by race and sit in racially segregated rows. So this wasn't also like a one-day activity. This lasted for 2.5 months. In this kind of simulated apartheid, students took on their actual racial identity in the present. So they categorized themselves, identified themselves racially, but teachers implicitly took on the role of the state, kind of correcting students who they thought had misidentified and regulating the racial boundaries. What I think this does, the idea when I spoke to teachers, they said, oh, they did the role playing because to build historical empathy, to let students feel what it must have been like. But what I argue in the book is that what this does is actually, instead of making the past close, it distances it because it teaches students that they wouldn't have access to the experience of being racially categorized or discriminated against absent the simulation, that they have to like pretend that they're in the past, as opposed to kind of discussing how South Africa is still structured along racial lines. And then finally, I talk about the consequences of this teaching. And what I find is that students really take on this ideology of individualism. They talk about racism as, they think of it as like a remnant that lives in old people's minds. They talk about this concept of like reverse apartheid, kind of like reverse racism. So they say that the way in this kind of complicated logic, they say that when I ask them, how does apartheid affect South Africa? They often said, apartheid affects South Africa because a lot of Black South Africans won't let it go, right? So it affects South Africa because Black South Africans haven't realized that it's over, kind of thing. And so what this does, the students, this is across race. These are the narratives that students told me. They resisted policies of racial redress, so they were very opposed to Black economic empowerment, like affirmative action policies. And another consequence of this is that it teaches Black students in these contexts that they shouldn't talk about racism in the present, right? That it's kind of illegitimate to talk about the ongoing effects of the past. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that sorry, it's a lot, but that's kind of the structure of the book and the argument. Yeah.
Well, I feel like that is a appetizer, and it does a justification. It does the book well in being a synopsis. But I do feel like there's a lot of implications to your work. And so I wanted to just now we can segue into some Q&A. I have a few questions, and then we'll of course open it up to the audience, and I've permitted everyone to talk, but everyone right now is muted. But so one of the questions I have, and also because the RIM network, it includes people who are in marketing and in business schools, as well as anthropologists and sociologists. So people really across the board, and people also who do work in public health. And so when we think about your work, it really helps to, I think, show some of the complexities of the South African. There's a lot, I would say, like the rainbow nation. There's a lot of those type of nomenclature used to describe the South African case. But when you think about your work, how does it help, or how might it help people across this sort of broad academic spectrum understand, who are not really experts in South African history, but understands South Africa today? So particularly, I think, because it highlights the experiences of post-apartheid South Africa from the perspective of these students are now probably older adults or young adults.
Yeah.
How does it help us to understand the realities that exist today? Because much of the racial inequality remains very much embodied in structures of South African society.
Yeah.
So I guess that's
Yeah. So yeah, thanks. So I mean, yes, South Africa is still like incredibly racially stratified, and I think what I hope my work does is it contributes to a conversation of, in a way, like, how is this possible? Like, how after apartheid, how is it possible that this is, in a way, how is it tolerated? How is it, how does that status quo continue to exist? How is inequality reproduced in an era of professed equality, right? And I'm not the first to say this. I draw on lots of other authors and lots of other theories of racism in the era of de jure equality. And really, what's emphasized there is the ideological underpinnings of kind of racial inequality, and how there's these ideas that allow it to go unchallenged, right? So these ideas, it support like the structural inequality, the economic stuff is supported by ideology and by kind of cultural processes and and frames and collective memories that provide ideological support for this for the structural kind of scaffolding of inequality. So here I'm kind of in the book, I'm trying to look at how, well, I think what the book shows is that young people born into democracy are being taught about the past, but they're being taught about the past in a way that implicitly legitimizes inequality in the present by teaching them that it's over. And we know, from literature in the US, right? So Eduardo Bonilla Silva, whose, book Racism Without Racist was very, influential for me and helped me understand a lot of what I was seeing. He talks about the storylines of colorblind racism, right? These stories that allow racism to go unchallenged, unchecked. And one of them is this idea in the US context, this narrative, the past is in the past. And that's really like what I see. And these other narratives of like, I never owned slaves, right? Whites in the US would say, I never owned slaves. And this kind of idea of like that it's an individual thing, like it's what individuals did, and it's not about a structural story that continues into the present. So I think maybe that's one of kind of the big kind of overarching implications. And the other one I think is thinking about these particular schools, and these are schools that for many Black students, these are kind of, these could be mechanisms of upward mobility, right? So they're very good schools. They're schools that can disentangle the historical conflation of race and class in South Africa. And this might be true for the individuals who go through them, but on the broader social level, what they do is they reproduce inequality. So also thinking about what do we mean when we talk about inequality, and when we talk about like the intergenerational transmission of inequality. And I think we can look at it at the individual level, like, so is inequality being reproduced within, like, within families? Do we see, that young people, when they grow up, they occupy the same kind of jobs as their parents did, or, so on. That's looking kind of at the individual level and aggregating up, but we can also look on the social level. So even if for these particular young people, these schools might be vehicles of upward mobility, on the broader social level, they're legitimizing inequality. Yeah.
Mhm. So I was going to ask some comparative questions, but I feel like you just addressed that really nicely, thinking about like colorblind racism and some of the ways in which that is manifest in the US, and then thinking about South African society. So I will both combine an audience question and add a little of my own spice to it. But Kevin is asking, can you talk about the genesis of the project and what compelled you to undertake it? And then I think that it would be really enlightening, because I didn't mention any of your personal background and the insider outsider status that how that impacted your ability to collect data, right? And to gather insight from youth, how your own positionality also impacted what you found. If you think I mean, I feel like it always impacts what you find, but what are the sort of positives and negatives of how you yourself identify and your own background impacted that as well. So the genesis of the project and why you undertook it, and then also in your own insider outsider status.
I mean, in a way, those two questions can, like, I could give an answer that combines them, but that would go through like my whole history. But let me just say that I came of age, and the thing is, I won't go into my whole, but my parents are South African, but I spent most of my youth living outside of South Africa, and we moved back to South Africa in like the late 90s, and the late 80s, early 90s, like, so it was like during the transition period, and I came of age kind of during that period. And I think, in the collective memory literature, there's this very robust finding that events that happened kind of national global events that happened during adolescence remain disproportionately influential throughout the life course. So there's this kind of generational effect of like of collective memory. And I think for me, just personally, that kind of I think has been something through that's come through my work. So I went to university in South Africa, like in when, I'm going to age myself now, but basically like when just after the transition, it was like and it was a very kind of hopeful time, and all these Rainbow Nation narratives were coming out. And the students that I study, they were born actually during that time. So I was trying to understand what did it mean for these, young people who were they're born free, so-called. But sort of from a more kind of academic, intellectual perspective, I guess, I came at this project I came at it through the collective memory lens. So what I was very interested, and my work before was on South Africa, but it was really about collective memory. So how do groups and nations kind of remember their pasts, and specifically, how do they remember their difficult, shameful, traumatic pasts? So I had done work, for example, on the Apartheid Museum, and looking at how the past is represented, on the national kind of collective level. And what I realized through that literature is that there's a lot of stuff about like institutionalized memory. So how is the past remembered in museums, memorials, textbooks, like institutionally? And then there is quite a bit of literature about individuals, but it's very much about, what the kind of like what I was saying now, this finding that, what events do you think were most important? And often you'll find that it was events that happened during adolescence, kind of collective national events. Or there's a lot of, kind of oral history work looking at people's the intersection of autobiographical and kind of national and collective memory. And what I didn't find a lot of was this kind of intersection, like how do people learn about how do they learn about the past that they don't have autobiographical access to? So histories, national, group, collective histories that they haven't lived through themselves. And there's a few institutions that we think of that, that communicate this memory, like the media is one way that people learn about it. The family is another major institution of kind of socialization, including mnemonic socialization. So socializing us into memory. But schools, I thought, were like this kind of key institution in society. And it's an institution where young people learn about the past in like history lessons. And what's interesting in particular about schools is that it's an institution where you are forced to confront the past, right? In other words, you can decide to go to a museum or not. Parents can decide if they want to talk to their children or not. You can, to a certain extent, choose the media that you're consuming. But in school, in a mandatory history curriculum, everyone has to confront it, whether you like it or not. So I thought it was like an interesting site in which to study the transmission and reception of institutionalized memory. So that's kind of how I got to it. In terms of my own identity in the project itself, I would say, so when I started the project, I thought, okay, I'm going to just find out what these young people think, and they're going to tell me, which I don't, I guess that's naive. And as qualitative researchers, also we know that's not really necessarily true. We have to think about the interview also as like a social situation. And this social situation, when I was sitting down with students, and talking to them, this is a social situation where they're talking to me. I'm a white South African woman in a school context, right? In many ways, I occupy the identity of their teachers. Most of the teachers in the schools were white South African women, right? So even though the schools were racially diverse, the teaching body was predominantly white, I would say. So these are still white-dominated institutions. And so I think what was very important for me in the analysis was not to take things at face value too much, but really to think about what was being produced for me in the interview context. And I think that so at the beginning, I started asking students, do they talk about race at home, or do they experience racism at school, or what about in the broader society? And over again, students across racial backgrounds would say, there's no racism, like there's no racism. And yet, Black students would then in the interview tell me about these very racist incidents that would happen to them. And then I would say, well, but you told me about this thing. What about that thing that you told me about that happened with the teacher? Is that not racism? And then they would say, well, it kind of is, but it isn't. So we do a lot of work to explain to me why it isn't really racism. A lot of times it would be, well, it kind of is, but it was also kind of a joke. And so when I was looking through my data as a qualitative researcher, I'm always very interested in outliers. So kind of disconfirming evidence, participants who say something different to what the majority were saying. And I looked for disconfirming evidence because in an early presentation for this project, I was talking about how students are being socialized not to talk about racism, even though they're experiencing it every day. And someone said to me, why are you privileging your interpretation over there? And if they're telling you there's no racism, why are you privileged? And I was like, well, they're telling me about it and I actually see it. And then so I went back to my data to try kind of understand what was going on. And there were a few participants, Black participants, who said to me, oh, there's tons of racism at the school, but there's nothing we can do about it, because if you say something, then people will say to you, oh, it's just a joke. Like, why can't you take a joke? Or they said that there's penalties. So like at the schools, you could get demerits. If you get enough demerits, you get suspended or expelled. And you could get a demerit if you were found to have been racist, but also if you were found to have, quote unquote, falsely accused someone of racism. So the burden of proof falls on the victim in this context. And it's when everyone around you is saying it was just a joke, like, can't you take a joke? Then it's sort of the barriers and the risks become quite high. And so the students who said there is racism, but we don't say anything about it, said to me, because there's nothing we can do about it. So we just keep our head down and we don't say anything. And so this helped me, I think, understand the normative climate in the schools. And the normative climate is we have to pretend that we all get along, that this is the Rainbow Nation, that we are the Rainbow Nation, and that we have to let the past is in the past, right? That we're not bringing these kind of historical discussions into the present. And I think that for me, I think I was definitely seen as a white authority figure in these spaces, as a friendly white authority figure. They told me about racist incidents. They would name the teachers and they would say to me, but you're not going to say anything, right? Or they would say, this is, they would talk about teachers and friends and kind of, they would say this is, because I promised them that it was confidential. So that they trusted, I don't know if they trusted me, but they trusted the confidentiality of the process for sure. And, but they still reproduce these kind of narratives for me. So what I say in the book also, and what I truly believe, is that I have no idea what these students really think. I don't know what they discuss at home with their parents, what they talk about with peers, but what I do know is what they think they're supposed to say in these schools, which are still kind of white-dominated spaces. Yeah. You're muted, Cassie.
Sorry. All righty. So we have some audience questions, and I want people to feel free to unmute themselves and ask their questions. But prior to that, I'll ask one last question. And now I forget so your work really is mixed methods in a way that you did the ethnographic observation, and you also interviewed these different, types of people, Black students, white, Black, white, colored, and also teachers. So, and then you drew also on some records. So I don't know if you can speak very briefly to the methods and what are some of the rewards that you feel like, or insight that were gained from different approaches, and then from combining them.
Oh,
Then
yeah.
I'll, after that question, people, you all can feel free to unmute yourself. Everyone should be able to talk. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you post it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. I think you get different things from the different methods. So if I had just looked, let's say, at the documents, then you don't see, like, you can see sort of the production of collective, but you don't really see how it's transmitted. And when teachers, so there's a lot of literature on textbooks, right? Even though these schools didn't use the textbooks, but they did use they used written materials. But what you get there is you don't really get, that's not what happens in the classroom. Like it's a resource that's used in the classroom, but it's interactive. So really it's it's collective memory is not, it's not just that's what I was trying to get at, not just the institutional production or then the inputs and the outputs, but like what happens in the middle, what are the conversations, what are the debates, how are these resources negotiated, selectively drawn upon, and discussed. And I think that I spoke about, sorry, how I was viewed in the interviews, but I think in the classroom also, my presence in the classroom was very normal and natural and unproblematized. I think because these schools, because they were very used to having sort of pre-service teachers and their supervisors observing at the back of the classroom, and those people, often would be white woman. So it was not unusual, although the duration of me being there was long, but it wasn't unusual for someone to be sitting at the back of the classroom. And I don't think that my presence kind of influenced that part of it too much. If it did, then I often think, wow, this is what happened like with the researcher in the classroom. Can you imagine what happens when the researcher is not in the classroom? But I actually think it was probably very similar to what did happen. But I think that also the observations coupled with the interviews were very important because I could reflect on it. So I had in one of my interviews with actually one of the Black African teachers, I started off the interview saying, what's it like to teach in an apartheid classroom? And she started talking about how it's very hard because you don't want to put the history on the students. And then you can have students, Black students saying, well, my mother's a domestic worker because she was denied opportunities and this leads to conflict in the classroom. And I said to her, oh, wow, like I was sort of surprised. I said, wow, I didn't see any of that when I was observing. And she said, oh, okay, well, yes, exactly, because I've changed the way that I teach to avoid that. And then she went into this whole description of how she changed the way she taught. And the description was this equivalences thing where she said she started emphasizing a lot that there were whites who resisted, that whites also suffered. And had I not been in the classroom and I just started the interview, in the interview, her mind went to the first classroom she taught where there was conflict. And then I could say, oh, I didn't see that. And then I got this whole long conversation about how things change. So I think this sort of triangulation, like seeing what people say and what they do and bringing those into dialogue is it can be very enlightening, and it can help you see the complexity of a social phenomenon. Yeah.
Wonderful. So do folks want to ask their own question, or I can read them? Hannah, can you see also in the chat?
I can see them. Should I
Okay,
just
yeah.
take them? Do you want to?
We can. Um, so I don't know that this order is related. So Judy talks about the Model C schools, and we'll try to address all of the questions in the chat. So can you talk about how attendance is determined in the Model C schools?
Yeah.
It's not based on residence, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
What
Well,
is?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, because they're very interested. So in South Africa, government schools, um, uh, okay, let me answer the question directly, and then I'll kind of complexify a little bit. So it is determined by residents. The schools have a catchment area, which is in the residence, and so both these schools are in neighborhoods that were historically white. Um, uh, Roxbridge is in a neighborhood that is still predominantly white. The demographics of the neighborhood around Glenville have changed a bit, where it's become, there's a lot of Indians who live also in that neighborhood now. And Glenville also, in its catchment area, it catches part of a town of Soweto, of a town of an African township, and students they bus in from there. So it's sort of in their catchment area, part of Soweto. So that's where some of the diversity comes in. So some of the diversity is Africans, coloreds, and Indians who've moved into historically white neighborhoods. So this is, people of color, but who are, middle class or upper middle class. Then there's the Soweto kind of catchment in Glenville. But also what's important is that it's residents, but it's the catchment area is determined by if a child's parent or guardian lives or works in the catchment area. And that's really important, that or works, because that means that if your parent is a domestic worker or a gardener, then you can go to that school. So you would find in these schools, you would find the children of employers and their domestic workers sitting in the same classroom. So that those dynamics introduce the race and class diversity into the schools. The thing about these schools is that under the South African Schools Act, these are government schools, but government schools in South Africa can charge discretionary fees. So they are fee-free schools, and it's determined by the socioeconomics of the neighborhood, actually, how much they're allowed to charge. And so because these schools are in more affluent areas, they're allowed to charge higher fees, and these fees are used by the schools so basically the school registers as a non-for-profit, and it charges fees through so it's a government school but also a non-for-profit, and it kind of raises funds, discretionary funds, which they can use on employing more teachers or buying computers. So these are quite well-resourced schools, also because of they're historically well-resourced, but also in the present they're quite well-resourced. But according to the South African School Act, schools are not allowed to turn away students if they cannot pay the fees and their parent and guardian lives or works in the catchment area. So that's in theory. In practice, they can put lots of hurdles in terms of how you have to prove that you can't pay. So they can make it quite difficult, but there are definitely students. So they're kind of complicated in that sense. But essentially it works on catchment areas. Yeah.
Judy, did you want to ask your follow-up question?
Yes. Hi, this is Judy
Hi.
Davis. And I'm here in the US, and I'm trying to just understand some of the, I guess, the day-to-day logistics of how things work, because it kind of sounded to me the way you described Model C at the beginning was that these are what we might call magnet schools, where I guess the higher achieving students have an opportunity to attend through some type of mechanism. But based on what you just said, that's not true. So that my assumption there just went out the window. So where you talked about the students are able to attend based on area of residence, and that's what I would call a local school. But again, it's not an equivalent model here in the US. To my understanding, there still is a lot of residential segregation in South Africa. So for the students who are now, the Black African students are now attending these Model C schools in areas that were formerly white under apartheid. How do they physically arrive at the school every day? Are they walking? Are they bused? Is there some type of transportation that needs to be provided? Just how does it work? And just how do they show up every day?
Good question. I asked them how do they get to school, and it's the range of like the options that you gave. Some of them walk, so some of them are like the children of domestic workers who live in those neighborhoods, but their mother is a domestic worker, so they live in these very affluent neighborhoods, but they live in a small room, in the garden. Some of them are children of upwardly mobile, Black, colored, and Indian parents. So they are, they're middle class, but they're Black, Indian, and colored, and middle class. Some of them are come from working class families, like the children of domestic workers, and then some of them, especially in Glenville, are students from Soweto who they travel on public transportation. So they take, in South Africa, a lot of there's these minibus taxis. I don't know if people are familiar. When you go to South Africa, you'll see them. There's like these minibus vans. That's like a lot of public transportation, and so they catch the minibus taxis and buses, and it takes them a long time. So actually the book starts with a vignette of a student who basically, she travels an enormous distance to get to and from school, and she basically traverses the racial geography, engineered by the apartheid regime. So and so she experiences structural racism every day as she goes to and from school, and then she experiences a lot of interpersonal racism in school. And she tells me about it, and so I open with this vignette where a teacher tells her, you can't. She's not going to let her make up a test because affirmative action doesn't apply to schoolwork, even though the student Sianda had missed the test because she was sick, and yet in spite of all of this, she tells me that she has a lot of fights with her father because her father stuck, quote unquote, in an apartheid kind of thing. And he thinks that, white people are out to get him and that they owe him something. And she doesn't believe that at all. She believes that you have to let go of the past, right? And so really the book is trying to address this puzzle, like how does a young woman who experiences like structural and interpersonal racism every single day of her life, how does she believe that this recent past of racial oppression and segregation should be like forgotten or at least ignored, right? So that's what so that kind of so the student, they have different experiences of getting to school and different experiences of their home life versus their school life, and the kind of homes that they live in versus their classmates. I think there's a lot of variation, and the two schools are actually quite different. So at Glenville, only 5% of the student body was white, and at Roxbridge it was about 50%. So, and yet I found very similar things in the two schools. They're still they're institutionally white, the schools, even though the demographics have changed to a certain degree. Yeah.
This is fascinating.
Okay, so one of the questions is about your AJS paper on boredom and how this notion relates to education around race and also memory work.
Thanks. Yeah, so the AJS paper is about, it kind of it's an elaboration, or it's sort of like a different take on the juxtaposition. So when I looked at, so in the book, I focus more on what juxtapositions does in terms of kind of teaching about apartheid as this event that came and went. In the AJS, I really focus on this idea that students told me over and over again that they found the apartheid section boring. In contrast, they loved the Holocaust section. They thought it was absolutely fascinating. They couldn't wait to learn about it. They were really interested in particular in Hitler and his psychology. And so what I tried to understand, again, this sort of puzzling finding, like why were young South Africans, first generation after apartheid, why were they telling me that they're bored with apartheid and really interested in the Holocaust? So this got me reading into also literature, the racialized emotions literature. And that literature really talks a lot about emotions with a strong positive or negative valence, right? Strong emotions like anger, love, guilt, and what I was finding was boredom, this kind of, it's sort of, it doesn't have the strong kind of valence. And what I argue in that paper is that boredom is, I look at how the boredom was constructed. So thinking about comparing how the two histories were taught, and then thinking about what does boredom do? What kind of emotion is this? And what does boredom do socially? And I think that boredom is an emotion that's related to in this, avoidance, denial, right? It's an emotion that it regulates against other possibly more difficult emotions like anger and guilt, right? And so it's if you're bored, you don't have to attend to those other feelings so much. So really kind of also thinking about like, what does it mean when teenagers tell you that that everything's boring? Like there's something else going on. And here, that something else that's going on is, this avoidance of more difficult emotions, and also then kind of showing how boredom sort of, so it regulates what can be discussed and felt, and it also serves this purpose of kind of distancing the past, I think.
Well, we are getting close to time or at time, but I want to allow for one or two more questions. And the last two questions from the audience also kind of ask about the South African curriculum. And one asked about settler colonialism, and the other asked about Western models of education versus Afrocentric models of curriculum. So I think those are two great questions. I mean, that the combination of thinking about the curriculum and different approaches to the curriculum versus the one that may be instituted currently. So maybe that's even thinking about possibilities.
Thanks.
So I think that would be a good note to conclude on.
Yeah, that's good. And thanks for these questions, because also, you know, a lot of times when I talk about these schools, a lot of it, because it is so, like, my research is so micro and it's so in the schools, that it can come out that it's like the problem is the teachers. Oh, if only we had better teachers, right? The problem is the teachers. And it's not, it's not the teachers. I think it's also the teachers, but it's also these broader currents, and the teachers are working within a national curriculum. They're drawing on like narratives and scripts that are very similar to those that kind of were institutionalized during the transition to democracy. So I also talk about how a lot of the narratives that they reproduce are very similar to the narratives that were produced in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it's not about problematic individual teachers and schools. It's about something broader going on in the South African context that manifests in very particular ways in these schools. So in terms of the curriculum itself, so the curriculum, straight after apartheid, there was history was kind of relegated from the curriculum. Like it was sort of seen as almost a problematic subject, because it had been used so much as part of like state building by the nationalist government, apartheid government. It was used as this ideological tool, and there was this idea of like wanting to move away from this kind of authoritarian form of teaching and teaching history for kind of the national, constructing the nation through history. But in 2000, I think Professor Kader Asmal, he was the Minister of Basic Education in South Africa, and he commissioned a sort of a review of the curriculum. And he was very interested in reintroducing history into the curriculum. And curriculum developers there, what they did was and I think it was coming from kind of, progressive goals. These were, the academics and labor stakeholders were involved, people, from labor movements were trying to move away from this idea of like that there is the state-sanctioned history. And they wanted to really prioritize kind of, oral histories and teachers drawing on their own experiences, and really to promote this idea of teacher autonomy in the classroom. And so what happened was the whole curriculum actually moved to, instead of regulating content, they would regulate sort of outcomes. It was this kind of outcomes-based education. And so the curriculum is actually, there's not much in it, the national curriculum. So the national curriculum, if you look at it, it has these like subject headings, like topics that should be discussed, but the content it's really left up to schools and teachers to fill out the content. What's interesting for me is that in these two schools that were on opposite sides, so the two schools, they're in the broader Johannesburg area, they were on opposite sides of the city, the teachers didn't know each other, and yet the lessons that they taught were so similar, even though neither of them used a textbook, which indicates that they were drawing on these kind of collective resources. And so I think that, and what also they tried to do was to move away from this idea of South African exceptionalism. So this idea that South Africa is somehow exceptional. And so what they wanted to do was they broke up history into themes, and they used South African history as an example of a theme. So under colonialism, they do learn about colonialism, but they would learn about, colonialism in the Cape and as a theme, and then they would learn about the US. And so it's similar to like the apartheid and the Holocaust. There've been a few curricular changes. At some point, it was also like apartheid, the Holocaust, Rwandan genocide, civil rights movement in the US. Like there were all these examples, and it was the overarching theme was human rights. So it was kind of this idea that it's not about learning history, it's about learning the lessons of history and these themes. And what this does, I think this is an unintended consequence, is that it chops up South African history. So, in one grade, you learn about, colonialism. Then in another grade, you learn about public holidays in South Africa. So then you'll learn about 1976 and, the Soweto uprising. It's all like kind of disconnected instead of, and so I think that's one of, people always ask me like, what should be done, which is always very hard for me to do because it's much easier to critique than to suggest, to say what, but I think one of the implications is that this thematic focus is quite problematic actually. And what it does is it disconnects the history. It teaches history in a very, and history is, it's a long story and it's a causal story. And so part of what animates student interest in the Holocaust is that it's told in this very causal way. This caused this and that caused that. And apartheid is taught like disconnected from what came before and what came after. And so, and because of that, then you can't see the continuation into the present also. So I think in terms of, I don't know if it reflects a Western model. I think a lot of it came out of like, there was, the curriculum was constructed through discussion with lots of different stakeholders and, lots of progressive folks, I think, were involved in the curriculum development. But I think this is sort of one of the unintended consequences. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and I knew that it would. And we're all, I think, a lot smarter now and better prepared for our upcoming conference. And I just want to thank you again for your time. And I hope if you haven't already gone out and ordered Distancing from the Past, that you will, because I think it will be a great read. Even if you just read it on the plane ride over, we'll have many hours to commute or wherever you might be commuting from. So I don't know if there are any announcements from the RIM folks, but otherwise we can conclude.
Thank you so much. Let me just say thank you so much for inviting me and for this great engagement. And I'll be happy, to continue the conversation with anyone who wants to kind of get in touch. And the conference sounds incredible, and Cape Town in January is great. So enjoy.
All right. Well, thank you everyone also
Thank
for
you.
coming and for
Thank
wonderful
you.
questions.
Thank
you
you.
both.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Chana.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you from Johannesburg, Chana.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Kathy.
Bye.
Thanks, Cassie.